mechanics. So, Rich, thanks for coming on. Can you give us a tiny background of your genius and where you get your smarts from and your specializations?
I can give you a background and specialization minus the genius and smarts.
Yeah.
Strength and conditioning coach, work in professional basketball primarily at the moment, but lots of different sports in the past. I balance my time between professional basketball, running a master's degree in strength and conditioning at the University of South Wales, shout out to them, and then running my own education kind of consultancy based courses and programs through strength coach curriculums for anybody who wants to give that baby a Google.
Nice, but whereas my specialization would probably be over the course of my aged career would be in like athletic development of kids, of the youth pathway, all that kind of boring stuff. Yours would probably be in, let's say, mechanics, biomechanics, agility, biomechanics, and change of direction, that kind of stuff, as well as teaching people.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Like, I'm really interested in multi-directional movement challenges versus what I would describe as very tongue-in-cheek, boring, easy, straight line stuff. Like the stuff that's really multi-directional, really complicated, that's close to performance versus kind of only seen in simple training environments. And ultimately, everything that I do tends to be training support, injury, understanding kind of components relating to situations which are change of direction, agility, multi-directional sporting situations primarily in team sports. And I guess I use the term biomechanics. I describe myself as an applied biomechanist, which means I'm not a real biomechanist. I won't argue with biomechanists. However, everything I do goes back to a foundational understanding of biomechanics and what's happening in these crazy movements, you know?
So you understand the skill, you understand the science of what's going on with forces in all versions of directions, and the difference in what you're saying is from the Usain Bolt into you're bored with that and you're more excited by Mia Hamm or LeBron James, the multi-direction sports.
I think that's probably a fair way to say it. Yeah, we'll go with that.
Yeah, see what I did by dropping Mia Hamm in there. I know a girls footballer. She's retired, but yeah, but still I also know that she's retired. The reason for this series is to delve deep into this, I don't know, let's say a pandemic of ACL injuries in women's sport, and that's how it's seen right now. That there's a real proliferation of ACL ruptures in women's sport, and we've talked in the past with different people about how frequently they arise. The research suggests, some research, bad research, 2 times more likely, others up to 8 times more likely than male sports. I'm looking at in the academy levels, so 14 to 20-year-olds. And I'm seeing nearly 20 times the occurrence rate of in girls' academies compared to boys' academies. So my feeling is that there are other things at play rather than like playing load and stuff we're talking about. So what is your experience with women's sport and kind of ACLs? And then we could talk about specific structures if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been in and out of, I guess, sports of both genders. Female football, I spent probably more time with female football athletes than I have with any other female team sport based athlete. Most of what I kind of relate back to from a female perspective, like, goes back to football actions as much as the men's stuff has been kind of more rugby, basketball. And I don't necessarily most people who deal with injuries and they are physio rehab, and they deal with more of a rehabilitation process. Like, I don't directly deal with rehab, but ultimately where my focus with both what I'm trying to achieve in a training and a developmental process is make people good, adaptable, 3-dimensional movers. That naturally has to come hand in hand with understanding the mechanisms and what is going to likely be your risk factors to avoid, and the postures and positions and outputs that you want them to be able to execute. So that's kind of led me down this path of, okay, I want to make people super fast and super agile, but they need to do that without compromising their safety. And then there's this argument of, is there a conflict between those two things? And yeah, that's kind of spawned the understanding and kind of spawned the thought process of where I am now.
Right, that makes a ton of sense. And we have some, so we've got a couple of physios on with different backgrounds. We've got some players from academy age, and then from internationals that have been through ACL, so ACL rupture and rehab. And I'm hoping to get this is all women, and I'm hoping to get a couple of male players of the same age on to discuss their experiences, because my belief is that the difference is stark, and that might be leading to some of the issues that we have. But how do you see the issues that women have, and what in your experience, and also from a biomechanics point of view, are the risks specific to women?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way we're beginning to approach that is changing. Traditionally, we look at female bony structure, like female structure, female anthropometrics, and then people talk about menstrual cycle, and they talk about all of the non-modifiable components.
So for a second, can I stop you there? And can you detail those biomechanical, structural things that are with, I don't know, culture is going away from those being reasons. I'm not ready for that to happen yet, but can you detail those things?
So let's take a really classic one. Pelvis width and what we call quadricep angle, Q angle. Essentially having a really wide pelvis, so your hips are further apart, and then naturally when the pelvis then goes down towards the kneecap, the kneecaps are closest to the midline of the body and the hips and the pelvis are wider. That creates a greater what we call Q angle, a quadricep angle, which essentially puts all of the musculature around the hip in a biomechanically disadvantaged position. In theory, on paper, all things being equal. And because of the fact that we're in a biomechanically disadvantaged position, that makes it harder to control the position and the forces and the risk that is going to be essentially directed towards the knee. So that is something, and I've been in the same kind of state as you are, that is something which I don't think we completely move away from. Yes, okay, we can't do a huge amount about it other than normal prevention things, but we've got the general increase in Q angle. There's other things we talk about with females as well, like joint laxity in terms of the way that they tend to stabilize movements, which is maybe less anthropometrical, less about kind of structure, but something that kind of talk about being kind of foundational in athlete or female athlete physiology sometimes.
So the Q angle, so going down to the Q angle is the length of the femur and the direction that the femur connects the hip, the outside of the hip to the knee, is different than in males. Mm-hmm. And that causes the muscles at certain angles to be weaker in a movement. Is that right? Is that kind of the theory?
Yeah, I'd say rather than weaker, to be really specific, it's the muscles are in a less useful position to produce force and control the knee.
It makes it harder.
It makes it harder for those same muscle groups and the same areas of tissue to do their role effectively.
Would it be safe to say even that it not only makes it harder, but it's almost a different job?
Yeah, I think that'd be fair. I think just the role changes. Role changes and the role gets harder. The role becomes more difficult for them. So ultimately, let's say you take a male athlete and a female athlete, to get a female athlete to the same level of what we describe as neuromuscular control and the ability to stabilize around that knee joint through or via primarily the muscles around the hip joint. In order to get two people to the same level, the female physiology has got to basically work slightly harder relative to what the male physiology does in order to try and stabilize and have those same kind of positions and outputs, essentially, just because the biomechanics, the leverage, the position that they are naturally in doesn't help them create that outcome.
So while we're delving into this, is there front door opening and beeping on? Is there yeah, so it's inarguable that this happens, that this does create this thing. It makes it harder. So to overcome this, would we, my brain would go, if it makes the muscle work harder, do we have to make that shape stronger, that movement pattern in a woman stronger to overcome this? Would that be the simplest way to overcome this one small area of risk?
Yeah, 100%. They are biomechanically somewhat predisposed to the fact that that's going to be difficult for their body to try and control because of the position and the shape that the athlete structure is built in. Therefore, instead of saying, oh no, we can't do much about this, or we ignore that as the, we focus on different risk factors. Of course, there's tons and tons of things which come into the puzzle here, but a logical way of approaching that is, okay, in that case, in the female population, these areas of the body need to be even more of a focus from a strength development and from a control development perspective than they would in a male group. So your need to focus there and your need to train and develop those qualities is increased quite substantially in comparison to a male group, because they aren't in those negatively predisposed positions already.
So while we're just delving down to this one factor of risk, from a parent's perspective, if they've got a 14-year-old girl, there are lots of factors we'll delve into, but for this one thing, what am I thinking I can do as a parent to help that child out? What are the muscles that they need to develop, or the movement patterns that they need to develop to help this one factor?
Yeah, look, great question. Very simply, all of the muscle groups around the hip and the pelvis. So glutes, lateral kind of glute group, so a glute med and a glute min are two smaller kind of muscles around that glute group. But also think that the glute itself needs to be really strong and capable, but there's also a surrounding structure of muscle mass that is also contributing. So it's not really about isolating this one particular muscle group. You want that glute complex and the muscles which externally rotate the femur, externally rotate the thigh. You want them to be stronger, faster recruiting, and you want them to be more comfortable with taking load. And the way that you get that is through generally trying to strengthen anything through hip extension. So anything that might be something like a hinge-based pattern, where they concentrate on actually trying to be able to use the hip instead of just bending at the knee all of the time, doing that on one leg, anything which then becomes like a single leg hop and land, because the landing is going to force them for that glute to stabilize that knee at high speeds. And really there's a whole host of, I guess, very simple exercises anytime they're going to be on one leg and they're going to be going from a low body height to a high body height, and changing that is going to have really big recruitment and output based benefits. And then you really think about faster speed, different variations, different angles to make it all synchronized and make it all essentially work as efficiently as a group versus a really kind of key structural area of strength.
So that would be get yourself a good strength coach or athletic development coach. But for
100%.
the general population, for teenagers that listen to this, we're talking about TikTok RDLs.
Uh-huh. TikTok RDLs.
TikTok RDLs. My experience will be a step up.
Step up. So simple step up. I would be like reverse lunge. So lunge where you step backwards instead of forwards, and it's exactly the same positions. And you're going to get loads of glute involvement, loads of that hip extension, single leg controlling the knee movement pattern. And yeah, do that heavy and slow, do that light and fast, do that bouncy, do that left and right, do that forwards and backwards, and really try and get the body, one, happy to use that part of the body and think, my hips are strong and coordinated and I can do all of these things. And two, that the actual tissues themselves are strong and capable, and that they aren't themselves going to be, at risk of excessive fatigue, et cetera, et cetera.
That's
so
awesome.
yeah, lots of things that can go in there, and they don't have to be complicated either. TikTok RDLs, reverse lunge, forward lunge to an extent, step up, lateral based lunges, anything which is kind of a single leg squatty up and down, or hips forwards and back based kind of movement. But of course, ideally, get a really good athletic development coach to at least assist in that in the early days for some education that will help people kind of go, oh, okay, this is the stuff that I need to be doing on a really regular basis in warm-ups, on days off, et cetera, et cetera.
So we fixed Q angles. Structurally, what else is the problem?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of the other things are, I think, much more debatable when they talk about the structure of, and also I say that things which we probably can't impact as much. And we talk about the structure of the end, or the shape of the end of somebody's bone, essentially, and how that's going to glide and how that's going to kind of orientate themselves. So I don't really think that there's any other things which are hugely impactful for people
without talking about stuff that we can fix. I'm just talking about what are theoretically the structural problems that are different, or the structural differences between males and females that might lean towards increasing the risk. That's all. Rather than how we fix them, what are the other potentially structural problems that might be at play? What do you know about?
I don't know what else I'd put on that. I don't know what else I'd put on that list, because I think there's things which you could argue are structural, but I don't know whether they actually are going to really increase. I mean, we're debating these days whether Q angle is generally a real thing that people want to have a focus on. And I think there's other things which
is a real thing. Whether it's the 100%. Thing that's causing a risk, that's the debate. But what I'm saying is Q angle is real. It does exist. We can discuss how much of an impact that is in the cause, but it definitely is real and has symptoms. It has effects.
Yeah, 100%.
Is there a difference in the feet? Because I'm reading recently about shoes and how differently and that it's part of the cause is that women play football in men's boots. So what is the difference between feet?
Yeah, I think there's people, again, so there's discussion about whether there's difference in feet, whether that is a female male thing genetically and structurally, then I mean possibly, but I think you've also maybe just got lots of different foot types between everybody in the population, male or female. And if you've got a foot type which is going to be, and I think it's possibly also related to the Q angle kind of structure as we were talking about, if you've got a foot type which is going to be really predisposed to this collapsing position, where the foot's going to roll through down to the kind of the midline of the body. So you're going to lose all of the arch of your foot. And that itself actually isn't a million miles away in terms of being related to that Q angle, and the fact that that's where kind of like the forces are going, essentially falling towards the midline, and then the foot ends up in that same kind of position. And so I think you do get that, but I don't necessarily say that that's a male female thing. I think that you've got, maybe there's some predisposition, but that's going to be variation, I guess, throughout the population with different people, and obviously harder to change. But if somebody has got that kind of foot structure which is really lacking stability, falling into this kind of internal rotation position at the right at the ground, then that has got knock-on effects that basically work their way further up the chain, essentially.
That makes sense. What can you break down the structural mechanism of an ACL tear? So it's fairly well, I don't know. I'm not sure if anything is known within science, but it's like received wisdom that there is a certain circumstance that is the most dangerous, for the most commonly present within an ACL rupture. Okay, so can you break that down from a mechanical perspective?
Yeah, 100%. So you're absolutely right. There's lots of different ways that a tissue, the ACL, can be torn. Essentially, it is a tissue. If it feels an excessive amount of load and stress, which passes its tolerance, it will become damaged to some degree. So there's lots of different ways actually, and you see different mechanisms, but primarily we talk about a combination of three things. So the ACL, as a really basic description, is stopping the tibia, so stopping the shin moving forwards relative to what the femur or what the thigh bone is going to do. So it's stopping your shin bone sliding forwards out of the front of your kneecap. And basically, we look at a combination of what we call anterior tibial shear, which is that motion that I've just described, shin moving forwards. So think of a vertical thigh bone, the shin connecting to that at the bottom to create a knee joint, and the shin sliding forwards in a forward sagittal plane based movement. That's one movement or one direction of force, which is going to add load to it. The other one is going to be what we describe as knee abduction moment, which is basically the knees falling into the midline of the body and or the feet being pulled to the outside of the body, which is related to those positions we just mentioned from a Q angle perspective. And then we have a rotational component, which is essentially where the thigh bone and the shin bone are going to rotate, and they're going to rotate inwards towards the body, and that creates like a torsion. Okay, that creates a rotational torsion. So we've got three things. We've got the shin moving forwards, this anterior tibial shear. We've got the knees moving inwards, which is creating that stress in kind of what we describe as a frontal plane position. And then we've got that rotational component, that rotational torsion between the femur and the shin bone, which basically creates sort of your third directional increase in force. And ultimately, like, that combination of things just puts way too much load onto that very specific tiny ligament-based structure, which is trying to stabilize everything all at one point. And that's typically going to occur in situations which are going to predispose that load to be in that location. So ultimately, for that tissue to end up in a tear, end up in a damaged state, there has to be enough load to hurt it, and there has to be the position associated to gravitate all of that load and all of that stress to that one particular tissue. Okay, obviously those two are very, very much linked together, which is why you then see the risks being so high and the situational occurrences being in things like defensive pressing. Hard defensive press, slight rotation to one side, and an athlete goes to stick their leg in the ground to kind of decelerate, to hit the brakes, and then they hit the leg in the ground really hard. They've got to really kind of push the ground away, which creates that anterior kind of shearing motion of the shin wanting to move forwards. Because they're rotating, they've got a kind of a rotational torsional component to try and control there as well. And then because of the fact that if they don't control the overall postures and positions of the rest of the body, they end up in a situation where they're going to be in positions that will increase that knee abduction moment of the knee moving towards the midline. And that's in these sporting situations like pressing, single leg landing from a jump, and any situation where you're trying to hit the brakes hard, but you're also trying to rotate, turn towards a new direction, control some momentum in your trunk all at the same time. And that ultimately creates that most common situation of a combination of those three kind of directional forces. But there's other things they talk about. Compression. You purely rupture an ACL just from that kind of axial compression. And they talk about even situations now when they think that the ACL might actually tear before the foot hits the ground because of other things that have kind of happened. But primarily we look at, those three: anterior tibial force, knee abduction moment of the knee moving towards the midline, and then that internal rotation, kind of rotational torque that happens. And that's happening in a situation, super high levels of load because somebody's maybe slamming the brakes on from a sprint. That's happening in a tiny little time frame, and ultimately the athlete is experiencing high levels of stress, positions which aren't distributing that stress appropriately, and then we get a very, very sudden ligament-based rupture. Less than 50 milliseconds from ground contact. As soon as that foot hits the floor, or we're even starting to think now slightly, very slightly earlier than that, because the positions just gravitated all that stress to one place, and pop we get, essentially.
So that's fascinating. How I describe the ACL in itself to my kids, to my girls, is that it's a seatbelt in a car, and
I love that analogy.
And it doesn't get used nearly all the time. You can drive a car without seatbelt all the time. It's only when you crash at the right direction does it then turn on, and it becomes essential. And so if you can think in your mind's eye, if your daughter begins to run from the goal line up the penalty area on the left-hand side of the penalty area to the corner of the penalty box as fast as they can, and then breaks and turns along the parallel line of the penalty box, the edge of the penalty box towards the D, that is the moment where the first example you used, the lateral and the rotational and the anterior forces there, is that left foot going into the ground there to turn right. That's where that danger moment happens. And the axial one would be if you're jumping out the first story of a house, as you land, just then, that's like top up down forces that could rupture it. So for the average parent, if you can just figure that those are the moments, they tend not to be. It's much less common, isn't it, to have ACL tear from like tackles.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. Like I think there's the other reason why it becomes really complicated, which is why we don't always go crazy down the athlete structure route, is because there's a big brain component. There's a massive kind of perceptual, what are they looking at? How good are they at splitting their attention? And generally the kind of the brain's part of coordination. So that kind of comes into the mix as well, which is why you get these heightened situations where they're trying to achieve lots of different things at once. They're trying to maintain speed, but they're also trying to turn to a new direction, and they're trying to put their brakes on, but do it in one step, or they're trying to land from a jump, but as they land, they've got somewhere else to be. So they can't land and kind of absorb and be safe. They're trying to land and cut or land and change direction all at the same time. So it's this complex interaction of the brain wanting to do something. Yeah, absolutely. Timing and sequencing in the motion is really, really crucial.
It goes to my seatbelt analogy. You can, if you're driving your car at 50 miles an hour and you see a car in front of you pull out, you can brake and then turn and go around that. If you're distracted and you press the brake too late, you might hit that and your seatbelt will come on. If you brake super hard and harder than you need to, and your seatbelt will come on. Or if you totally miss it, you will whack it and your seatbelt will come on. All of those things. So you have all of the skills. So the player has all of the skills to brake, turn appropriately, to go around that obstacle they see ahead. It's just that if the timing of that sequence is wrong, of them turning the wheel or them pressing the brake or taking the foot off the accelerator, if any of those are wrong, the seatbelt comes on. And depending on how much force, how much speed they've got in their car, how much momentum, or how much momentum the car coming at them has, their obstacle, it determines how hard the forces on that seatbelt are going to be.
Absolutely.
That's it.
Absolutely. So it's having both the strength and the capacity to hit the brakes, but also knowing when to hit the brakes, how hard to hit the brakes, and to not try and do stupid stuff, to not attempt to do absolutely movement skill and this kind of overall package of kind of athleticism, which is really where the agility kind of concept comes in, is that it's a package of perceptual, cognitive, brain-based skill and of physical attributes. 100%. Yeah, versus just stronger only, which of course is a massively beneficial starting point and is a huge foundation, which of course there has to be. But then there's kind of like, okay, there's other stuff we need to think about here if we're really going to solve this problem, because evidently the problem's not being solved at the moment, is maybe, I think, a fair statement.
Yeah, but if you learn to drive first and then build the engine, so you can go faster. But if you build the engine, you also need to upgrade the brakes so that you can brake harder, because you'll be going that much faster in the first place. And then upgrade your driving skill. That's why you have advanced driving courses if you're going to be driving faster, because we've got elite movers. The kids playing at elite. There aren't any elite kids. But as kids accelerate through their footballing athletic journey and get to top levels of sports, it's as fast as a human body can move. They're also expected to stop at a rate that is the most a human body can stop at. So it's the braking forces that are massive. So yeah, the analogy lives on.
I think you basically then create those 3 tunnels, right? Acceleration. Keep the car analogy. Acceleration, you can have as its own bucket. The braking component, I think you have as a separate bucket, purely because we've got to emphasize it, because we're very used to, in sports science, looking at propulsive stuff that makes you go faster. So you have those 2 separate buckets, and then you have the skill learning to drive bucket. And ultimately, you're trying to improve all of those in a balanced way that creates an overall package of athlete, versus just trying to make someone faster, jump higher, propulsive, accelerate more. You've got to have that package kind of situation to have something that's going to be really risk-free and optimally functional.
Absolutely, sounds great. So we've been through the mechanics. From mechanics and a skill acquisition, that's a sports science term we use these days. You use, can you give 3 maybe solutions or nudges to behavior which will help reduce the risk for a kid?
Yeah. Relates back to what we mentioned earlier about that need to develop strength, and to develop strength in the right areas and the right ways, not for aesthetic based reasons and kind of body shape based reasons, but strength that's going to be really useful in sport. So I'll definitely say that that's a huge behavioral thing that people need to develop and people need to understand, is that if you only play football, it will leave a number of different important physical qualities vastly left behind, which at some point in time are going to catch up and going to cause you problems, whether it's an injury or whether it's just a performance ceiling. So generally that lower limb strength, primarily strength on one leg. So those RDL patterns, step up patterns, reverse lunge patterns, and enter in anything else that you want in there. That's kind of the big one for me.
So quickly, while you're on that one, is there a difference between boys and girls as the average, say, 16-year-old academy footballer, a 16-year-old academy female footballer? Is there a difference in those?
Do you mean in terms of their approach to that type of training?
In there, I don't know. Do you see a difference in? We're looking at the reasons why we have this epidemic. Is there a difference in the strength of those 2?
The chances are the male 15 or 16-year-old, if we're thinking football academy, we're thinking that kind of developmental pathway, they are relatively well supported, relatively well catered for. They probably train at a nice training facility. They have all of the bells and whistles because they are part of this men's performance pathway. Female sport probably doesn't get the same kind of provision, doesn't have the same access, doesn't have the same volume of members of staff, probably has a different, kind of athlete to coach ratio in some circumstances, depending on kind of, club or academy size. And I think that probably the best way forward, while that will, I think, over time slowly begin to close the gap as female sports continue to, to get more focus. But I think that especially as a developing athlete of that age, or a parent of an athlete at that age, taking it into your own responsibility, for want of a better term, to think, okay, this is going to be really important. The provision isn't optimized yet in order to try and support that in some cases. So these are the things that this young athlete needs to be doing in and around their general training. And I think that that's the other side of the risk discussion about, okay, structural things and biomechanical things, but actually that's a huge part of why we probably see increased risk factors. But
So
of course,
boys,
it's both, you know.
so boys do more strength training than girl footballers. That's
Yeah.
part of what you're saying. Is there
Yep.
is there any though? So they're more likely to train than do strength training. The boys are more likely to do strength training than girls.
Mhm.
Is there? So let's set aside the amount of training they've already done. Are boys more likely to be stronger than girls? Are girls more likely to be stronger than boys of the average age? And does that play a role in this?
Yeah, I think it does. So boys are more likely to be stronger. Not only are they more likely to be stronger, they have also got that slightly less risk factored structure, essentially. So not only are the girls probably weaker by that point because of the way they've gone through peak height, peak weight, velocity, which I'm sure you've touched on the podcast before. Those things ultimately mean the female athlete is physically probably behind where we'd ideally have them from a risk factor perspective, as well as having a structure which makes being behind even more of an issue. And they're also then in an environment, or they may be in a culture which doesn't support and facilitate closing that gap as fast as what we want to close that gap. Essentially, that's going to be that cluster of things that comes all together to create this heightened, 8, or what you were saying, kind of 20x times risk than what we're seeing.
So I just, while we're on strength, because strength coaches and stuff, but just for the mom or dad listening to this, is that we're not talking strength as in one person can lift 200 kilos off the floor and the other one can only lift 80 kilos off the floor. You mentioned the word relative quite a lot, but not in the terms of relative strength. But that's what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, don't think about it as enough, because I think this is a psychological barrier for people. Don't think about it as strength as just being able to lift an arbitrary object more effectively, or or heavier one. Just think about it as their ability to control their own body and to coordinate their own limbs. Essentially, strength is only, the importance is that they are strong based upon their body shape and their body mass. If they are a young athlete who is like a center midfielder who's going to be light and they're going to play quite a dynamic change of direction, style game, the amount of force that they need to produce, the amount of strength that they need to have, doesn't need to be the same as somebody who is a big, tall center back. And that doesn't need to be comparable to a male athlete of the same age or the same position. The athlete needs to be good at and strong enough to control their own body, stabilize their own body, use the appropriate parts of their own body when they move, so that when they run around the park and they're doing these kind of much more highly specific football-based movements, they have got control, they've got stability, and they are both effective and safe when they do that. So it's really about thinking, how do they move themselves versus how do they move something else? And that, of course, has to have this foundation of strength, but don't make the comparisons between, or you don't really need to make the comparisons between male and female in order to think this person needs to get stronger to control their body more effectively and to coordinate themselves more effectively.
But when you're strength training, if you can look at how much you weigh in relation to how much you can lift. So you can do a lunge with 50% of your body weight, or can you lunge with 75% of your body weight? Like, the more you can lift in relation to your body weight in doing those movements we've talked about, a single leg RDLs, if you're doing backward lunges, which is my wheelhouse, if you do step ups, the more you can lift in regards to those, the greater the advantage is not right. You're reducing the risk. Also, would you say that part of this is fatigue based? So like, if you create a higher ceiling of strength and you're required to break 36 times during a game at full speed, that you're each time getting more and more tired. But if your ceiling is 90 times in a game, then you're only up to 50% of your fatigue capacity, your tiredness, so that you're not increasing the risk by constantly pushing the red line of that of where you're capable. Does that?
Yeah, 100%. So it's not, think about it as, think about the strength or the physicality, the physical attributes that we need as both output, the amount that you can lift relative to your body weight, but also think about it as how can you sustain that when you're trying to play a 90-minute football match? Because you can have really, really good levels of output, which is a very good, important place to start at the beginning, because it will help kind of raise everything up. But we also need to there needs to be enough tolerance. They need to be able to repeat that a sufficient number of times, which doesn't mean that you maybe want to move to everything being endurance based and everything being kind of high repetitions, because that won't help that foundational relative strength output. But there's got to be both of those, because there's and you can debate this from an ACL perspective, but is the ACL more at risk towards the end of a game towards at the beginning? Some would say yes, it is. And ultimately we need to have the capacities to be able to repeat those actions in a way which we can still do it with the quality which we would do if we were fresh,
with the rhythm and sequencing that you need when you're fresh.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
I sadly talk about rhythm way too much for most people, but I fundamentally believe it's a key to good. You can see when somebody is within rhythm or not, and the better they are at that, the more in sequence they are in their whatever movement, change of direction, speed, whatever.
Yeah, so avoiding jerky movements and everything having some kind of fluidity to it, because that shows that things are coordinated. It shows that things are happening at the right time, and ultimately your body doesn't like jerk. That's something that's always going to be a risk.
I managed to interrupt your one of three things there and turn that into a 10-minute thing. Can you quickly go through the other two? And I won't open my mouth.
Yeah, the other two that I would probably give. So one is the foundational strength, relative strength, and being able to control your body weight. The second thing that I would talk about is going to be more what we call plyometric based, more about jumping. Okay, so much more about landing and being able to produce force very, very quickly. They tend to be the two foundational kind of components of a lot of ACL prevention programs, strength based and then plyometric based. So jump-based movements, which may or may not be on one leg. So a single leg hop and hold, or a rebound on a single leg, a rebound on two legs, a hop and a hold on a single leg from to the side instead of forwards with a rotation, etc. Lots of different things you can add into that. And that is they are ultimately strength qualities, so relative strength qualities, but you're asking them to be applied in fast, fluid, and rhythm-based situations. So even when you hit the ground hard, you're hitting the ground hard and you're slowing your body down really quickly, but you're doing that with good coordination and good rhythm and good sequencing. And then that's going to be the speed of protection that we need, because remember, the ACL is probably going to tear within the first 50 milliseconds of ground contact, which is so fast, the actual strength qualities aren't going to be the only answer to try and protect it in that case. So anything that becomes jumping, sprinting to an extent goes into that box as well. Anything that becomes jumping, fast, hop, land based movements to get the strength qualities to work quickly and fluidly in movements which are closer to what football based movements look like, essentially. That's going to be my second one. And then my third one is going to go back to that analogy you used earlier about learning to drive the car, is they need exposure to the kind of situations which they need to be comfortable and capable of. And I think it's a surprise to somebody sometimes when you realize, let's take defensive pressing as an example. How many times are they exposed to that kind of movement in quite a complex, competitive situation, when they have to execute the movement while also thinking about some of the challenges that they need to think about when they perform in competition, and they're really learning to drive that car, and they're thinking, how fast can I go? When do I need to slam the brakes on? How much can I turn here? Can I do this to my left? And can I do this to my right? And they really begin to understand what we describe as affordances. They learn, okay, I can do this, but I'm not as comfortable doing this, and they'll adapt the way that they play. And obviously we try and fill those gaps through training. And ultimately that means that they've then got this foundational strength, the foundational speed and coordination and rhythm in order to be able to use that. And they've got that wider bucket of, I can apply this into a movement, which is going to be my high risk movements. And I know what I'm capable of. I'm not going to try and slam my brakes on in like 3 steps really late as I'm approaching an opposing player. I know that I need to be running at these kind of speeds, and this is the kind of space I need. And I know that I'm more comfortable on one side or the other, so that they don't put themselves in the positions which are going to dramatically increase the risk factors. And that's the way that I would tend to split that up, similar to the buckets we made earlier about this acceleration and propulsion through this kind of maybe strength-based things we were mentioning earlier, these landing deceleration based component through some of the more kind of plyometric based work. Those two are very much kind of blurred together, by the way. And then this learning to drive the car, learning to coordinate, make good decisions, do things in more specific based movement patterns, essentially.
Love that. That's awesome. That's pretty much covers the topic beautifully there, Rich. Appreciate your time. Is there anything you think? Is there anything extra you would like to add to the ACL debate?
No, I think that a lot of the debate historically has been, or a lot of what we have focused on has been the things that which we can measure, and been the things that we can measure in the research, and our peer-reviewed articles and our science leads the direction with this very much. But that is obviously limited based upon what we're capable of collecting numbers on, essentially. And I do think that there's a lot of pieces in this puzzle, and we're seeing it a little bit more now with cognitive-based considerations. I think there's a lot of pieces in this puzzle which actually we maybe have to appreciate. We can't measure that perfectly right now, so we maybe don't have really strong data to support it. We do all of the stuff which we've got strong data to support, like we've just mentioned, but there's actually going to really be answers to this puzzle for me which we just haven't quantified properly yet. But if you look at movement, like you mentioned, rhythm isn't something that we quantify in any sports science. But we want to see fluidity and rhythm and timing and coordination. We don't have the data to support exactly what that should look like, but that is for me as a massive part of the puzzle. So that comes hand in hand with, we have very much looked at landing from jumping, vertical based stuff. Lots of the prevention programs are slightly more vertically orientated kind of programs. And again, I think we need to move a little bit more to multi-directional. I'm entirely biased saying this, by the way. Of course, we need to move and look towards more multi-directional, free-flowing, 3-dimensional movement challenges, essentially. But until we get a little bit more clarity on exactly how that looks, that's a tough recommendation to kind of make for people, I suppose. And the foundational stuff that we've mentioned is going to be for really me, is going to be 80% of the problem, I think.
Like that a lot. Really appreciate your time, Rich. Is there anywhere people can get in touch with you or see more of your work?
Yeah, general social media. Generally try and be active. I'm Rich_Agility Lab on Twitter, which is probably where I spend most of my time. And then Strength Coach Curriculums is going to kind of be found on Instagram and most of your other locations. But yeah, happy to kind of answer questions, support anybody who maybe doesn't have that around them, essentially have that system or have that structure around them, just to make sure that we can try and solve this problem over time, essentially.
Awesome. Dude, appreciate your time. Thank you.
All good, mate. Nice to chat.
There you go. Good work, dude. Let me stop that.